Our second speaker, who you'll hear from shortly, is Dr. Sana Jaffrey. She's a research fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University in Canberra, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with over 15 years of experience conducting research on international and Indonesian politics. Would you please welcome Dr. Jaffrey?
Good evening. I'm going to talk today to you about Indonesia, and specifically, I'm going to talk about the impact of the global fuel crisis that is forcing some politically difficult choices for Indonesia. And I'm going to conclude by noting how all of these new pressures combined with sort of old standing issues in Indonesia are going to turn likely Indonesia into a more volatile neighbor politically and also economically. But before I talk about the crisis, let me just, the global fuel crisis, let me just sort of lay it out that Indonesia's current challenges predate actually the war in the Middle East. And so Indonesia enters 2026 in a really difficult three-way squeeze. President Prabowo is really trying to and struggling with managing three pressure points. One of the things he has to do is he has to provide patronage for a supersized political coalition. He's got more than 80% support in the parliament. There's one party that is not in his coalition, but also refuses to acknowledge itself as the opposition. And so they're not opposition, but they're just not in government. This is great for him politically. It offers him a very consolidated political rule, but managing this coalition requires resources. One of the ways in which he's done it is offering ministerial positions. He's got almost 50 ministers, almost 50 vice ministers in his cabinet. The other thing he has to do is provide programs that can provide resources to the political coalition that they manage, their parties and their supporters. The other thing he has to manage is delivering on new welfare promises in a system that is already made extremely welfare heavy by the preceding president, Joko Widodo, who oversaw an expansion of Indonesia's welfare base during COVID and never contracted it. Indonesia is also one of the largest levels of energy fuel subsidy provider. On top of that, Prabowo then promises in his election campaigns more welfare programs to his supporters. Finally, he has to sort of balance all of this by maintaining fiscal credibility with investors and ratings agencies, etc. All of this is very difficult to do in the first 2 years, and what we end up with in Indonesia, sort of entering in 2026, is a slow-moving governance crisis, where you've got sort of governments, local governments especially, that are under a lot of strain because of the efficiency measures that have been implemented to save money for all of these different priorities. You've got local governments who are not able to pay teachers on time, who are not able to service sort of basic services on time. Some of them are trying to raise money by increasing land tax, etc., whatever is at their disposal. This leads to a lot of public discontent. Then you've got a lot of public anger over elite perks, etc., that are being provided to political members of Prabowo's coalition. In August of 2025 last year, what you had was one of the largest and most violent riots Indonesia has seen since 1998. And this was sparked first by the provision of sort of elites and extra payments for members of parliament who are already seen to be quite entitled, but then also what we saw was a police repression and a lot of sort of repression from security forces that then turned those demonstrations into really sort of violent events. On top of this, there's a lot of pressure from investors, from like the agencies that are watching all of this and sort of feeling very nervous about Indonesia's credibility and ability to manage all these promises and all of these things that it's trying to do at the same time. So what you have in earlier this year, even before the war starts, is the rating downgrade for Indonesia that specifically says that Indonesian fundamentals are quite good, but what they are concerned about, Fitch and Moody specifically, are policy credibility and sort of a more uncertain policy-making environment. Now, in the middle of all of this, what we get is a big external shock. So what we have is the war in the Middle East. But I want to note that Indonesia is actually quite in a better position than some of its neighbors have been. It has a diversified supply of fuel. So it doesn't face the same supply squeeze that some of its neighbors are facing, for example, the Philippines. It also has a lot of coal-based electricity generation, which means it's not in the same tough spot that some of its neighbors are. So the main challenges that this conflict in the Middle East is posing for Indonesia is to maintain affordability of and the second thing is to manage inflationary pressures, the price of everything else going up because fuel is just more expensive and things are also more expensive to import. So this is now forcing difficult trade-offs for Indonesia along the same three pressure points that we saw before. What are the choices? The first choice would be passing the rising cost of fuel on to the consumers. So keeping the subsidy at its current rate and then letting people purchase higher levels of higher priced fuel. This would be fiscally prudent. A lot of countries in the world have done it, but in a place like Indonesia, that would actually mean that could trigger a lot of political protest. And Prabowo himself sort of coming of age in two political crises in Indonesia. One is back when he was young under Sukarno, and then in 1998. He's very unlikely to go this route. In fact, my bet would be that they would try to hold this off as much as possible and try to compensate with increased fuel subsidies. The second option would be cutting the flagship programs, the really expensive flagship programs, such as the red and white corporations, the village corporations, and also the free lunch program, the free meal program. But these programs are actually designed to provide patronage to his political base, not just the voters who are expecting welfare benefits, but also to the political workers and supporters who have made his election possible. Cutting this out from under them could result in a political backlash from them and undermine his political support. Finally, changing the law to raise the deficit ceiling of 3% that Indonesia has currently is also an option. This could increase the room that Indonesia has to manage its finances, but doing so without a plan for then getting back to normal is going to then again undermine Indonesia's fiscal credibility even more when it matters the most. So these are difficult choices for any country, very unenviable choices, but they are made even more difficult because of President Prabowo's governing style. The first thing is his command style governance. He doesn't treat the state, the way in which his government is leading is not treating the state as a complex bureaucracy where everybody has a role to play. In fact, it's more like a command and control center where people are given orders and then everybody at the bottom has to sort of figure out a way to make things happen. And this has led to a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion amongst the bureaucrats when efficiency measures have been enforced in the past. He's also averse to political opposition. In a moment of crisis, opposition can do two things for government. One thing that it can do is it can actually help provide legitimacy. The second thing it can do is try to channel dissent through parliament and institutions rather than on the street. He has again and again stated his aversion to political opposition, to opposition parties, which is raising the risk that all of this sort of dissent from this is going to end up on the streets and not actually be institutionalized. Finally, he has again and again sort of cast the public discontent in terms of foreign intervention, foreign schemes, as if all of these things are just contrived and not real. And that's a cognitive barrier to managing a very complex crisis that Indonesia is now facing, as well as other countries. So what's the outlook? I think all of these sort of pressures are going to make Indonesia a more volatile neighbor. What you're likely to see is policy drift is likely to continue. You're unlikely to see any decisive sort of choices being made. Instead, you'll see a lot of tinkering around the edges and then abrupt sort of changes when things become too bad. You're also going to see, I think, in the coming months, economic pressure building up. People and manufacturers not able to sustain their current workforces, layoffs, et cetera, inflation, and also tighter household budgets, which is going to sort of lead to more public discontent and possibly protests. Finally, and this is, I think, one of the sort of more concerning risks to think about is managing discontent in this environment, especially with this governance style, may become more coercive. What we might see is the government relying more and more on security approaches to manage this instead of actually solving the problem, sort of trying to manage the messengers and people who are trying to make these problems visible for government. I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.